Welcome to Lesson 4. In this lesson, we'll provide some background on Fujitsu Computer Systems NetCOBOL for .NET. We'll also cover the functionality and background of NetCOBOL for .NET. We'll learn how to create solutions and projects and set options and learn how to compile and debug your COBOL programs. The topics that we'll cover are as follows. What is NetCOBOL for .NET? And then some history and background. We'll also talk about and see Visual Studio 2005 integration. We'll discuss the COBOL language landscape, code reuse, and we'll talk about how to mitigate some migration issues that I'm pretty sure that you're going to encounter. And then we'll also see a demonstration about setting options, creating solutions and projects, setting the debug and release mode, compiler directives, and then of course compiling and debugging programs. All that's ahead right now. Fujitsu's NetCOBOL for .NET is a COBOL compiler created specifically for Microsoft's .NET framework. The compiler produces Microsoft Intermediate Language, and that executes under the Common Language Runtime. One of the most significant and powerful features of the product is that it can adapt OO-COBOL syntax and supports .NET specific extensions so that your COBOL programs can be written to take full advantage of the .NET framework classes. Now, all of these features and capabilities will allow you to bring your COBOL programs and applications into the world of Internet applications, including XML web services and ASP.NET web pages. It will also allow you to integrate your COBOL code and COBOL applications with code that's been written in other languages. An additional feature of the compiler is the capability for interoperation with COM and existing native code compilers. NetCOBOL for .NET also includes a high level of integration and support, including code behind support for the Windows Form Designer and the Web Forms Designer. IntelliSense is also supported in the editor environment. Now, another important feature is the ANSI code page and Unicode runtime data modes, which will aid you in migrating and mixing ACP applications in the .NET Unicode environment. At this point, I'd like to point out that Fujitsu was the very first COBOL vendor to build support for .NET in its compiler product portfolio. Back in 2001, Microsoft approached several COBOL vendors to add this level of support into their products. At the time, Fujitsu Software was the only COBOL software vendor to begin working on this, and they added this support. In February of 2002, Fujitsu Software announced NetCOBOL for .NET Release Candidate, and in April of 2002, NetCOBOL for .NET was made generally available. In August of 2002, Fujitsu added new features in the form of Windows Forms and Web Forms support in order to facilitate rapid application development in the Microsoft Visual Studio environment. New versions of the compiler were released in February and July of 2003, and in October of 2003, Fujitsu Software announced that NetCOBOL for .NET assemblies could be used as stored procedures for Microsoft's SQL Server Yukon. NetCOBOL for .NET version 2.1 of the compiler was released in September of 2004. And finally, the latest version of the NetCOBOL for .NET compiler, release 3.1, was released and made generally available in September of 2007. Another important capability for COBOL programmers is the level of integration by NetCOBOL for .NET and the Microsoft Visual Studio environment. Now, I've used many development environments over the course of my career, and I can tell you that the Microsoft Visual Studio environment is, hands down, the best I've ever used. Now, moving on, many of you will recall the almost religious arguments about which language was the best for a given purpose. In fact, we've all heard the press say that COBOL's days were numbered, and many in the press have been trying, unsuccessfully I might add, to write the obituary for COBOL for many, many years. I'm very pleased to tell you that COBOL continues to evolve. The impressive level of integration with the environment and the framework make NetCOBOL for .NET an equal player in the development language landscape. Let's take a look at the COBOL world just for a moment. One of the goals that Fujitsu had when developing the compiler for the .NET framework was to maintain a balance between existing code compatibility and usability with .NET. The majority of our Fujitsu customers are at least at the ANSI 85 level, the COBOL 85 level, but there's still a couple of holdouts. The feeling was that the NetCOBOL compiler should be backward compatible at least to the COBOL 85 standard. Now, the NetCOBOL for .NET compiler supports the current COBOL standard, so you might ask, is there anything special that I need to do to my programs to make them run? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. If you've been using another COBOL vendor compiler, you'll need to isolate and deal with some of the vendor-specific dialect issues between the two compilers. Now, keep in mind that Fujitsu tries to adhere to as closely as possible to the ANSI standard. Some of the implementations may vary just a bit, but if you have COBOL program that is spot on ANSI standard, your program should compile and run with no problem. Now, based on my experience and that of our customers, we believe that you can expect to see a range of 65 to 95% compatibility depending upon the COBOL dialect that you're using. In my experience, the validity of the COBOL procedural logic is nearly 100%. And again, the closer you are to the COBOL standard, the better off you're going to be. Now, one other question that you might have here is, do I need to do anything special to leverage the .NET framework? And the answer to that question is yes. It is possible to take a standard procedural COBOL program and compile it and make it run, and it should run just fine. But to get the benefit of leveraging components from the .NET framework, you will need to embrace and use at least a small amount of object-oriented COBOL. Now, don't worry about that just now. I'll get into more depth and discussion of object-oriented COBOL in the next lesson. In the meantime, your takeaway should be to recognize that programs migrated to .NET need to take advantage of .NET features by using a little sprinkling of OO COBOL programming. Now, some of the additional areas that may need some attention would be in the area of database logic and screen I/O and transaction processing logic and so forth. Let's visit just a moment about database access for just a minute. Depending upon the embedded SQL that you're using, you may have a very low level of maintenance to that code. If you're using indexed files, you'll definitely need to do some work. All of the COBOL vendors have their own ISAM, or Index Sequential Access Manager, file formats. Fujitsu's is reasonably robust, but it does have a few important limitations. If you still want to keep your ISAM files, I strongly urge you to use the pervasive btree product. You can maintain your standard COBOL I/O statements like read and write and rewrite and so forth with a simple directive. One COBOL vendor allows their COBOL customers to keep their EBCDIC data and process that EBCDIC data. You need to know that the Fujitsu compiler is an ASCII compiler only. If you are using EBCDIC data with your COBOL programs, you will need to convert your data to ASCII, and there may be some necessary logic changes to your COBOL programs as well. So if you run into that particular situation, you should contact your Fujitsu sales representative and have him work with you in order to get you some consulting support from a Fujitsu systems engineer. Now, one last thing. Screen I/O logic can be also a bit of a wild card in your conversions and migrations. In the .NET world, you may have a significant opportunity to convert your application from whatever it is that you're using now to either a Windows Form application or to a web forms application. Now, the wild card part that I'm talking about here is that your level of effort will really depend on how embedded your screen logic is in the normal business processing logic of your programs. The less embedded the screen I/O is, the easier and faster your conversion will be. Now, I've seen a lot of code out there, and believe me, based on my experience, I believe that we are really all over the map on this one. Take care on this particular issue.